Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes pretty fast if you're the car chick. Now here's he is.
Hey everyone, it's the Car Chick. I want to apologize for being a few days late in getting this podcast out, but we had an uninvited visitor this weekend called Hurricane Florence. She hit us in the Carolinas at a Category 1, which is a far better than the Category 4 that she was when she was out at sea. But the problem was, this hurricane was like a Floridian driving in the mountains. She was moving so dang slow, and in the left lane, of course. So she just kind of moseyed on into the Carolinas and then sat over us for 3 days, dumping torrential rain. Fortunately, where I am just outside of Charlotte, we had no problems at all. We all prepared, we hunkered down, we made sure that we had water and batteries, and most importantly, wine and munchies. And so we had no problems at all. And I was able to get a video out to everybody about how they could protect their vehicle from damage from the storm. And hopefully that helped out a few of my neighbors. We do have a lot of trees here, and we had a lot of trees come down. We did experience a lot of flooding in certain parts of the Charlotte area. And of course, our cities on the coast like Wilmington had severe flooding, and they're still dealing with that aftermath and assessing the damage. So we got lucky where I am. I didn't even have the direct TV go out over the weekend. So I'm very, very lucky, very, very blessed. And my heart goes out to those who have suffered damage and are still suffering from the after effects of Hurricane Florence. What I wanted to do today is talk about what are the impacts of storms like this to the car market. For Florence, obviously, people are just now figuring out what's going on, what is damaged, what their losses are. They're contacting their insurance agents and filing claims. So it's going to be a few weeks before we have an idea what the damage to vehicles will be. We do think that it's probably going to be less than 50,000 vehicles totaled out, fingers crossed, from this storm, because we did have time to protect a lot of vehicles. A lot of people were able to evacuate in their cars out of the storm area. Dealerships took as many precautions as possible to protect their inventory, getting the cars to higher ground, making sure they weren't in flood zones. I even know some dealers that took their best cars and put them up on the lifts inside their service shop just to try and protect them from any possible flooding. But we will still see a lot of damaged vehicles. We saw the footage of cars underwater, in the streets in places like Wilmington and New Bern, North Carolina. So we're just going to have to see how all that shakes out. And it's certainly not to minimize the pain to any people that did experience losses, but on the big picture scale, we probably are not going to see huge effects from Hurricane Florence like we did, this time last year from good old Hurricanes Harvey and Irma that slammed us, in Texas and Florida within 2 weeks of each other. So I want to kind of talk about, we're still feeling the effects from those storms in the used car market. So I want to talk about what really happens in these situations and what do you need to be aware of if you are shopping for a used car? Because we are still seeing used cars on the market that were damaged in Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We're seeing cars from Hurricane Sandy in 2012. When a storm comes along and slams us, it's not just the immediate aftermath to the car market that we have to worry about. There are long-term effects as these vehicles kind of sneak their way around the secondary market and find themselves on dealership lots. And you as the consumer may not be aware of it. There are ways for these cars to sneak their way back on the market without a big, scarlet letter on the side of them saying, "Hi, I'm a hurricane car, I'm a flood car." There's lots of ways around that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and what you need to be aware of as a used car shopper when you're looking for vehicles. Hurricanes Harvey and Irma had such a huge impact, particularly Harvey, when it made landfall near Corpus Christi, Texas last August. And it was a Category 4. And it's probably gone down as the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history, with a price tag that exceeded $160 billion. That is billion with a B, people, in property damage. And to put that in perspective, we thought Hurricane Katrina was bad, but that's over 3 times higher than Hurricane Katrina. Then Irma was also a Category 4, and she came along 2 weeks later, completely uninvited, and she slammed Florida. And again, we saw damages in $100 billion. It was just crazy. And between Harvey and Irma, they destroyed nearly 1 million cars, 1 million vehicles. Nearly 500,000 of those were in the Houston area alone. And the reason that those areas were such a huge impact is because Houston it's the 5th largest city in the U.S., and it has an extremely high percentage of car ownership as compared to other areas. So, just for perspective, about 200,000 vehicles were destroyed by Katrina and about 250,000 by Sandy in 2012. And that's because New Orleans and New York didn't have as high a population density that owned cars. Obviously, New York has a huge population density, but there's a lot of people there who have the good sense not to own a car in New York and to just take advantage of the public transportation, because owning a car in New York is just horribly expensive. So for perspective, that's why there were so many more vehicles that were damaged by Hurricane Harvey than in other hurricanes. So what happens when one of these crazy storms hits, and what happens to the cars themselves? A lot of vehicles, most of them get totaled out because the damage from a flood there's so many different things that happen to a vehicle. The water just seeps in everywhere, and that water, it's not yummy, nice, clean water. It is nasty, bacteria-filled, disease-ridden water. And it turns the car into a toxic waste hazard. The poor people that have to handle these vehicles for the insurance companies and body shops that even do repairs on them, they have to do it in hazmat suits. Literally, it's that dangerous to work on those cars because of the bacteria and other just toxic stuff that gets into the vehicles from the toxic floodwaters. So it's just something that you don't ever want to have to deal with. And that's why most of the vehicles get totaled out. Their electrical systems also get completely fried. Once you get water into the intake, into the engine, your engine's just done pretty much at that point. Few vehicles survive becoming submarines. The exception to that would be the 65 Mustang that my ex-husband had. His parents bought that car. Beautiful vehicle. They bought that car when they got married. And actually, it was a 66 GT. Beautiful car. And when my ex-husband was a teenager, they live in Hendersonville, and the house the driveway's a big hill that goes, downhill, and the second level of the house, they have a walkout basement, and there's a swimming pool down there. So my ex-husband was coming home one day, and this really was not his fault. I'm not picking on him. He's a good guy and a good car person. But he came home one day, and their habit was always, you kind of put the car in gear and you just run out and open the gate and then run back into the car, because the emergency brake on the Mustang didn't work at the time. Well, he didn't get it parked perfectly flat, and so he runs around and opens the gate, and as he's running back to get into the car has already started rolling down the hill. And here he is chasing after it, and it's going down the hill, and he just knows that it's going to smash into the basketball goal that's at the bottom of the hill at the driveway. But no, at the last second, it veers to the left, avoids getting creamed by the basketball goal, and proceeds to go into the swimming pool. So they call the fire department, which is right down at the end of the street, and they know their family really well. And so they spend pretty much the rest of the evening and into the wee hours of the morning having a carpool party where the fire department had to pump all the water out of the swimming pool. And then they used concrete blocks and wood planks to just kind of put the car up. One wheel was still on the pavement. And so they were able to kind of jack the car up and get it out of the pool and then drive it out and push it out. And then they drained all the water out of it, changed the spark plugs, changed all the fluids. And you know what? That dang Mustang started back up. That is one car that I can say has survived flooding and been okay. But it's a lot easier on the older cars. Cars these days are way more complicated. They have way more electronics and they just don't survive anymore. So, there's something to be said about, the good old classic cars and the simplicity of the way they're put together. But, the cars that became submarines during the hurricanes in recent years are not going to be quite so lucky. And so those cars get totaled out. And when cars get totaled out, they're not just automatically destroyed. They don't automatically just go to a junkyard and get crushed and turned into scrap metal. They get salvage titles, and in most states, they get that branded flood title. But that doesn't mean that follows them everywhere. They can still be sold on the secondary market. And a lot of these cars, a lot of them get shipped overseas to third world country markets where, they still have some value there. So a lot of the cars that we saw totaled out from Harvey and Irma did make their way overseas, but a lot of them stayed here. And what can happen is not every state requires a title to be branded for flood damage. There are some states, and these states tend to be the ones that, say, get hit by hurricanes regularly. They don't necessarily have those protections. And so even if a car is titled in a state that does have that flood branding, what an unscrupulous small dealer can do, and unfortunately, there are dealers out there that do this. They buy those cars, they can take them to one of these kind of loose title states, I call them, get them titled there, and then go get them titled again in another state. And what it does is it's kind of like laundering money, but it's laundering titles. So they can, in many cases, get around that flood branding. So you have to be really, really careful. And unfortunately, that's just kind of what happens. And that's why a lot of these cars, even from, 13 years ago, Hurricane Katrina, some of those cars are still out here on the market. I'm going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to talk about, what other impacts there are to the used car market when these hurricanes hit. And most importantly, what you as a consumer, if you're shopping for a used car, what can you do to avoid buying one of these hurricane cars? I will be right back after this. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a fair price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 888-575-2138. That's 888-575-2138. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Where the rubber meets the road.
Nice to meet you. Love your asphalt.
Hey, nice treads.
It's Straight Shift with the Car Chick.
And we're back at the Straight Shift talking about the effect of hurricanes on the used car market. Fortunately, our little visit from Hurricane Flo, while there is significant property damage, especially to our folks on the Carolina coast, we're not going to see the ridiculous number of vehicles being totaled out like we saw from Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma this time last year. But we will typically see some effects of that storm in the used car market. And, obviously you're going to have to watch out for flood cars. And in a couple minutes, I'm going to talk about what steps you can take to research used cars to try and identify some of these cars that may not have that branded flood car title or scarlet letter blatantly identifying them. But there's some other effects that people don't really realize, and we probably won't see a lot of these effects due to Hurricane Florence because of the relatively low numbers of vehicles that I hope will end up being totaled out by this storm as compared to, the nearly 1 million we lost in Harvey and Irma last year. But when that happened last year, and when we do see one of these big storms and a large number of vehicles are damaged, destroyed, totaled out as a result of the storm, we see obviously used car prices go up because, it's simple supply and demand, right? We lose a lot of these cars in the market. This happened after that horrible cluster that was called Cars for Clunkers, about 10 years ago too. So anytime you take supply out of the market, and also demand goes up because you have a lot of people that are having to replace their destroyed vehicles. Obviously, demand goes up, supply goes down. Econ 101, your prices go up. And it's not just private individuals, having to replace their cars, but dealers lost inventory in those storms as well. And dealers may lose some inventory in Hurricane Florence, especially the folks, out in Wilmington and our other cities on the coast. So those dealers have to get new inventory to replace those cars, both new cars and used cars, because, a lot of brand new cars got totaled out as well back in Harvey and Irma. Hopefully the dealers were able to protect their inventory better this time around, but we'll have to wait a few weeks to start seeing those numbers come in from the insurance companies. So you can expect used car prices to increase. Hopefully they won't go up much in this area. And it's not just in the areas that are affected, because the auction houses are, all over the United States. And so a lot of times what happens when you have a storm is the dealers go to an auction in another region to replace those cars. So, we saw last year a lot of dealers in Florida and Texas because the big car auction houses down there were affected too. So all those dealers came up to the Carolinas and even up as far as, Pennsylvania and Michigan and even out to California and went to the auctions there to buy cars, therefore driving up demand and driving up prices. So you tend to see the prices being affected all over the country when you have a big event and a lot of cars are lost. Another thing that happens is that insurance rates often go up because you better believe that the insurance companies are going to spread their losses out. So, obviously rates, in the areas where the hurricanes happen will go up, but they don't want to just kill the premiums for the people in those areas. So they just raise their premiums across the country to help recover those losses. And, that way not one group or geography is killed by it, but, we all end up paying the price to cover these losses all over the country. And, sometimes those costs can end up being, in the billions that get spread out across all of the, people that have policies across all the companies across the United States. And of course, you're going to see flood vehicles. It's just going to happen. Not all of them get shipped off to South America or to Africa. A lot of them did. A lot of them could happen this time, but we need to find ways to protect yourself against these cars. So here are some tips for that. Number one, there are some protections for consumers. After Hurricane Sandy back in 2012, the federal government, they updated the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System. It's one of those databases they have out there. And they updated that to include some protections for consumers against fraud and what they consider unsafe vehicles. And so this database contains a repository of info on salvage vehicles, including vehicles that have been deemed a total loss due to flood. But it's not idiot-proof. It's not foolproof. So there are ways of getting around that. I talked a little bit before the break about how dealers can kind of launder titles and sneak those vehicles back onto the market. Sometimes, hundreds to thousands of miles away from the flood zones for people that are, kind of not suspecting. Obviously last year, people in Houston were very aware that if they had to replace their car, they were trying not to do it in Houston. They were buying cars out of state. But, a vehicle from Houston could easily end up, in Wisconsin or Ohio or Montana. So, shuffling that inventory around and washing the titles is something that absolutely happens. So, you can go to, the National Insurance Crime Bureau and the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, both of these databases, and I will put some links to those in the description of this podcast, so you have links to them. But they can identify vehicles. So if you're shopping for a used car, always run the VIN number through one of these databases just to see what may come up. If nothing comes up, don't, think that means, this vehicle is perfectly fine. You still need to take some other precautions. I always preach about buying a Carfax report. Never, ever get a used vehicle without first looking at a Carfax report. Most of your good dealers will provide it. Some only provide auto check reports. That'll work in a pinch, but it doesn't have nearly the same amount of information as a Carfax report. So if you can get a true Carfax, that is absolutely the best thing to do. And if it has a branded title for flood, the Carfax or the auto check will say that. But you have to look deeper, because if the title has been washed, or if it simply has been in a state that doesn't require branding for flood, it might not have that giant scarlet letter at the top of the Carfax report. So here's what you do. I literally look at 30 different pieces of data on a Carfax report. And I'm not going to go through all 30 here. I think I covered that in another podcast earlier on. But you need to read through the data and see, every time a car, the registration information is updated, there should be a record in the details of the Carfax report, because the DMVs do report that data. So you need to look at where that vehicle was titled. And sometimes it will get as specific as, the city and the state. But if it was titled and look at the maintenance records, any of the other records that are on the details of that Carfax, if it has records in a city during a time when a hurricane hit that city, that should be a red flag. It doesn't automatically mean that vehicle was adversely affected by the storm. That vehicle could have been on high ground. It could have been, in a garage somewhere and been perfectly fine. But it should, give you a little bit of red flag to say, ooh, hey, this might be a vehicle that was affected by, Hurricane Harvey, if it was, in Houston area during August, the end of August of 2017. It does require you to research where exactly the hurricanes hit and when, and I keep a running database of that information. So when I'm shopping for used cars for my clients, that is one of the checks that I automatically perform when I am evaluating a used car. Did this vehicle live somewhere during a hurricane? So that's just some details that you got to kind of dig into on the Carfax report. And if the vehicle did live in that area, then, you have to decide, okay, am I just going to skip this one and move on and look for another one? Or simply realize that, okay, when I have this vehicle inspected by, an ASE certified master mechanic, what you should do before you buy any used car, make sure you ask that mechanic, hey, please specifically look for flood damage, because this vehicle may have lived in a flood area during a hurricane. Any good master certified technician will know how to look for the signs of flooding. So that is kind of the best thing that you can do. Now, if you are looking yourself at a used car and evaluating it and being able to tell whether or not it's been flood damaged, there are some pretty blatant signs that you can look for. If this is not your area of expertise, I do recommend that you have that inspection done by a mechanic, by a body shop, somebody that's going to have the detailed knowledge of what to look for. But if you want to, take a cursory look at it yourself, you may be able to see some obvious signs, especially in, the recent aftermath of a storm. One of the things you should do is open the trunk of the vehicle and, pull up the floor of the trunk or of the cargo area of the SUV or van. That's where the spare tire is located if the vehicle has a spare tire. But look underneath the carpet, look at the padding, look at the metal down there, see if there are any water stains. Water stains, paint, it stains fabric, it stains pretty much everything it comes into contact with. So you may be able to see some signs if you start literally looking under the covers of this vehicle. So look in the spare tire area, underneath the cargo area in the trunk or the cargo space of the vehicle. Are there any, funky looking lines, anything that looks like a water stain? I mean, you know what water stains look like, and you've probably seen them on your laundry or your own sofa, or, when you spilled a Diet Coke on it or whatever. So look there. You can also go into the car, into the back seat, pull the back seat, the backrest parts, pull those out, pull those down, start looking underneath there. Sometimes you need to actually have a mechanic unscrew on both the seats and look underneath, because the padding underneath and behind that seat is, the water damage can get in there and it can stain and it can soak, and no matter how hard they try to dry out the cars to hide this damage, sometimes you just can't hide it. There are usually telltale signs, literally underneath the covers of these cars that you can identify as damage. You can look in the door panels and see, does it look like there's any stain marks in the door panels? That leather or faux leather that is on the sides of the doors, even the plastic, the water can stain that. Sometimes you've got to pull off a door panel and look to be able to see it. Now, granted, a lot of, your dealers and, people selling their cars really don't want you to start tearing apart the car to look for these things. So, you just will have to look at kind of the exterior and see, are there any signs of, previous flood damage? Literally look underneath the carpets in any areas that you can get under there and look, because that's where a lot of that damage from the water is going to be located. And there's a lot that the unscrupulous dealers that are trying to hide flood cars, and these are typically going to be your kind of buy here, pay here type dealers that are selling cars to folks who are in a little more desperate financial situation and aren't necessarily in a position to have a car inspected, or just may not be as educated in the importance of doing that. So, but it can happen at your bigger dealerships too, and I hate to say that. And, certainly, if I ever heard of any dealer that was doing that, they would be on my blacklist forever. But, sometimes they, inadvertently buy a car at auction that, is a flood car, and they don't know it, because a lot of times dealers, when they're buying used cars for their lots, they're buying them sight unseen online at the auctions. And it's not until they get it into their own service department that they may see this. And they may not catch it either, because they're not necessarily looking at that level of detail. And if the car looks pretty good, they go through their mechanical inspection, they change the oil, whatnot. It just really depends on how thorough their inspection process is. And, they may end up inadvertently putting one of these cars on their lot, and they honestly didn't know it. They just didn't do quite the level of diligence that I would hope they would do on their used cars. So there's a lot of ways these things can get back onto the market. And again, run that Carfax report, look for those details on where a car lived and when storms hit those areas. Run the VIN through that National Insurance Crime Bureau or the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System databases to see if they have any records. And just always, 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 no matter what, have any used car that you're looking to buy inspected by a certified, preferably an ASE certified master technician who is trained to look for these things before you buy it. Those are some things that you can do to protect yourself as a car shopper, after these storms. And, be aware, you got to kind of look back, because we're seeing cars from storms that hit, 13, 15, sometimes even 20 years ago. Those things are still on the market. So you just have to protect yourself. It's a buyer beware when you're shopping for used cars, and you want to make sure you get a good quality used car, not a used submarine. I did a video on this, a little bit more detail after Harvey and Irma last year. So if you want to check that out, you can do so. Go to carchick-tv.com. That will take you to my YouTube channel. There's a lot of good videos out there. There's the video about the impact of Harvey and Irma. There's the video about how to protect your car against if there's hurricanes coming into your area, or even just during a nasty thunderstorm. There's a lot, if you know a nasty thunderstorm is going to come through and your vehicle is not able to be parked in a protected garage, there are things that you can do to protect it from damage from falling tree limbs, flying debris, whatnot, because cars do get damaged during normal storms too, not just during hurricanes. Folks, until next time, drive safely and avoid buying a submarine. I'm out of here.
The Straight Shift Podcast is copyright Leanne Shattuck, The Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of Leanne Shattuck or The Car Chick.